Today we're talking a little bit about sensory processing disorder, or SPD. Now, the interesting thing to think about when we're talking about a disorder or a syndrome is usually it is a collection of symptoms that kind of get all bundled together, and if you or your child just so happens to have enough of the boxes to tick, you get put in that box. So really, in looking at these things, I don't like those in terms of syndromes or disorder or things like that because they don't tell us exactly why something has occurred. But what we can do is we can kind of pick it apart and get a good understanding for what does SPD encompass and what might we see SPD accompanying in terms of different types of diagnoses that you might receive from a pediatric therapist or your pediatrician or your family practitioner. So what is SPD and what kind of senses are we talking about? Well, there's the 5 traditional senses: touch, smell, sight, taste, and hearing. Now, in SPD, we might have issues with 1, 2, 3, 4, or all 5 of those. And I like to add 2 more senses on that we don't always talk about, but they're very important in terms of development for sensory and motor and being a human. So if we're talking about those, we're looking at the vestibular system, which is going to work with balance, and we're also going to look at the motor system, movement, because as a whole thing, we've got to integrate all these things into our body. So the interesting thing we're looking at is the sensory system is kind of like a highway, and we want to have nice, smooth pathways that are direct to carry information from the body to the brain. Those senses are kind of like vehicles that are traveling along this highway. And so if we have a nice, smooth road, things work relatively well, and that's how the body normally operates. But if we've had some hiccups in the past, it could have started with birth trauma, essentially one of these areas is not necessarily having that nice smooth road that we need. And that's going to be taking into account the central nervous system. So if there are bumps in this road or areas in the nervous system that are functioning inefficiently or less good, if you're driving 70 on the highway and you hit a speed bump, that's going to be a little jarring. So taking into account that we could have issues with sensory, there's usually 2 different groups or 2 different classifications that we have of sensory processing disorder. We can have sensory seeking, or we can have sensory avoiding. Sensory avoiding is going to be where, I can't keep my shirt on, can't keep my shoes on. I get in the car and immediately shoes off, socks off, tops off, shirts off, diapers on. Maybe we'll keep it there, maybe not. So this constant fidgeting that just things don't feel right is a good indication that there may be some sensory challenges from a sensory avoiding nature with your child, or even us as adults. These things don't necessarily go away. The other thing we might see is sensory seeking, and this is if we're looking at a child who maybe in the midst of a meltdown just needs somebody to come up and give them a big hug. And that sensory seeking, or that reassurance that they're getting from the hug, from the compression, from the pressure, that's what their body's craving. And so essentially what we're doing is we're taking that bumpy road and we're sending so many cars down it that it's momentarily pounding down those speed bumps because we're overwhelming the system and kind of just giving it too much input. In this instance, that too much input helps to calm everything down because it just kind of exhausts things. So these are the 2 types of categories that most sensory processing disorders are lumped into, either that sensory seeking or avoiding. But what are some deeper signs that we might be on the early onset of a sensory processing disorder? And what can we do to find these things, identify them, and start helping ahead of time? Because as we know and as we've talked about, lots of times the idea of let's just wait and see is pretty much the equivalent of doing nothing. You're just waiting and you're seeing. And to me, that's being on the sideline. We'll call it that. So in taking that approach of waiting and seeing, we're kind of just hoping that they'll grow out of it. And as kids don't always necessarily grow out of something, what will happen is they will grow into the next thing in the line or the next problem or the next diagnosis. And that's really, really frustrating for a parent. It's also frustrating as a fellow provider who takes care of a lot of these kids. And to have one diagnosis become another diagnosis, it's tough. And I hear you, and I'm here for you guys. So let's talk a little bit about what are some of those early signs that we might be looking at so we can get ahead of that game. If we're looking at sensory seeking, these are little ones that can't sit still. They seek thrills. They want to jump off the top of the stairs. They want to fly. They want to climb up on the top of the house. They want to spin in circles until they fall over because they're dizzy. They might be able to spin and not get dizzy better than you can. These kids don't necessarily always pick up on social cues. They may not recognize personal space. They might be right up in your grill. These are kids that oftentimes will be putting things in their mouth and chewing on things, and not just a finger or a pacifier, but everything. Everything's fair game. If it's on the ground, it's in the mouth. These are kids that may overly seek visual stimulation, so looking at phones and screens and playing games, not the outside games of board games, playing video games and just being plugged in. These kids usually have problems sleeping. They may have a high pain threshold because their system is just so wound up. They may be constantly touching things. This is the little one that you take to a new place and you lose sight of them, and then 5 minutes later, every single cabinet door has been opened and shut 12 times. One of those interesting things, right? They may also be seen rocking or swaying or always in a constant movement, and this is just a good indication that their systems aren't very comfortable at rest. And that's really where their system should be. Kids should be able to grow and develop, and if we're talking about the nervous system, that's that parasympathetic region of the nervous system, the part that allows them to chill out, to grow, to relax, to heal. And if they're stuck in this sympathetic portion or the fight or flight portion, which is the other side of the coin, well then, of course they're going to be everywhere. That's just what they're pre-programmed to do. So if we look at what are some sensory avoiding signs, these are going to be kids that have a very low pain threshold. Everything's overly dramatic, everything's super painful, everything's very hurtful. These kids may appear really clumsy. They may trip over everything. They may not have very good hand-eye coordination. And this really kind of goes into looking at that movement and balance portion of the senses. Because if they're sensory avoiding, if they're trying to get away, if they're having too much, then these coordinative systems, they're not doing what they're supposed to. These are kids that may cover their eyes or their ears quite often. They're sensitive to light. They're sensitive to heavy sound. They may be very, very picky with food preferences. It may be hard for them to chew or swallow. The actual physical thing of having food going down their throat, it just gets to them. These kids often resist hugs. They may not like to be up in personal space. And if you sneak up on them and touch them, they may be really averse to that. So, we really have to take into account looking at these guys to be focused on getting them comfortable and being able to relax and be comfortable in a situation where we can work with them and gain their trust. And that's a process sometimes. These children usually have difficulty controlling their emotions and also focusing their attention. So what can we do to help? That's the big question here. Well, oftentimes these kids are exhibiting a whole collection of stuff, we'll call it, that really points to this, that. We call it the perfect storm. And the perfect storm is a situation where there is a collection of a whole bunch of different things going on with a kid that's overwhelming their nervous system, and it's causing a breakdown in that highway. It's adding speed bumps, it's putting in potholes, and their ability for their nervous system to function normally and properly is getting derailed. Those cars that are operating on that superhighway of their central nervous system to channel information up to their brain to be processed and then taken out to the motor processing or the emotional processing portion of the brain, that input, that information isn't coming through in the proper way. So the brain is processing this misinformation, and it's not that the sensory system is saying, the color blue is dog and that sour is a rainbow. Those aren't the types of sensory things that we're seeing. We're seeing smaller changes through the way that child can perceive each individual part of sensory system through their senses, which again is going to then go be processed up by the brain, which is getting information that's a little bit off. It's like playing the phone game, and the message changes from the onset till the end. And then when your body or their child's body is acting upon that output coming back down is also going to be not exactly what it should be. If you're putting bad information in, you're going to get bad information out. And that bad information out is going to lead to that entire long list, and I'm not going to throw back on the screen because we just talked about it over the last minute, of symptoms or the behaviors that your child is exhibiting. So when we're talking about perfect storm kids, this perfect storm of all these things coming together leads to something called dysautonomia. And dysautonomia is when the nervous system doesn't quite have all of the things it needs to function normally. That failure to function normally is going to be the nervous system's struggle to regulate both internal and external factors through either sensory or the internal regulatory components that it should be utilizing and doing every single day. So where does some of this stuff come from? The thing that's really interesting is the first real system in our body to develop as we're within our mother growing and developing is that nervous system. It starts to grow within the womb very early on, which leads us to our first possibility of where does some of this stuff come from? So if mom's in a constant state of distress or anxiety, or having a really tough time with her pregnancy, or she doesn't have the proper support, this is going to lead to hormonal changes in her body. Stress hormones are a real thing. They change the way your body works. Your bloodstream, mom's bloodstream, shares a very intricate link with baby's bloodstream. The hormonal releases by mom affect baby. And so if we have these hormonal releases or these changes, that is going to have an impact on the development of baby's brain and their central nervous system. Number 2, birth intervention and birth trauma. So if we're looking at things like forceps delivery, vacuum extraction, inducing, having a C-section, whether it's planned or whether it's not planned, whether it's emergency, and this is getting into another thing. We're in South Florida and my wife is pregnant right now. We're about 7 months along. So we're taking a hypnobirthing class. And the other night at class, our doula read off what the cesarean rate is down here in South Florida. And previously, when I talked about cesarean, we noted that, it was between 29 and 31% throughout the United States in 2019 to 2021. It's 70% down here. And that's crazy. That's wild. That's a lot. So if we're bringing it back into birth intervention, these are all things that can disrupt the function of the brainstem. This can put a significant strain on the upper cervical regions of the spinal cord. And the interesting things about these regions are those are the most important areas for processing and integrating sensory information before it reaches the brain. Think of the brainstem as the air traffic control system, and it's also the filtration system for all 7. Remember, we're adding balance and movement of your child's senses. This is responsible for not only organizing, but processing all of the information, but also keeping out some of that unwanted information. So kind of think of it as like a catch-all filter. So this unwanted information that our brain and body tries to filter out is called nociception. And we kind of think of those kind of in a blanket as, we'll call those pain signals. Now, if your child is sensory avoiding, then there's a good chance that there is an overabundance of these nociceptive signals that are coming up through the nervous system, and it's getting all caught in that bottom of the brain, and they're having a hard time regulating all of these nociception events coming on. Now, on the flip side of the coin, if your child is sensory seeking, then they're looking for something called proprioception. Proprioception is basically your brain and your central nervous system's ability to know where all of the parts of you are in space at any given time. And if there is a breakdown in that message sending up from the sensory system to the brain, where we're having a hard time in understanding where all the different parts of our body are and what they're doing, then that child's going to want to have that sensory experience. They're going to want to be held. They're going to want to have pressure around them. They might do really well with a weighted blanket. I mean, hey, who doesn't want a weighted blanket? So what can we do about this? And what kind of steps can we take to get a better indication of, well, is your child's nervous system functioning properly? Or are there areas in your nervous system or your child's nervous system that could be made to work a little bit better and more efficiently? Well, that's where we come into play. As a neurologically focused pediatric chiropractor, we're intently focused on what's going on in your child's nervous system. So when we're looking at a new case, we have a 3-step process for our examination that takes into account 3 different parts of the nervous system. We check heart rate variability, which is going to tell us your child's ability to adapt to a new stressful situation, and also if they have a predisposition to be in that sympathetic or super high flight stage, or if they're kind of stuck in a parasympathetic stage where everything's just kind of ho hum, low and depressed, body just not kind of being that upbeat, spunky bit that a child should be. The second thing we'll see, looking at thermography, is what do the subcutaneous blood vessels of the child do? Whole lot of mumbo jumbo, right? Basically, the temperature of the skin on both sides of the spine, going from the bottom to the top, should be relatively uniform in a way that progresses when we go from the bottom to the top. So if it doesn't, side to side, or as we're going up the chain, if we see large variances in difference, those are areas of the nervous system from that regulatory standpoint that we can't control that are functioning abnormally. And those are indications that those are areas or speed bumps that your child may have in their nervous system. The last thing we're looking at surface electromyography, SEMG. That's all you got to remember. What this is going to tell us, it's going to tell us how much energy is your child expending just to stay upright. And in most cases, we have a good range that things should fall in. Let's say everybody should have 100%, and that is perfect. And I'll tell you what, ain't nobody perfect, so it's okay. But if your child is exhibiting 200%, 400%, 800%, 1600% of the total energy of their body going into this motor state, and they're always so tense and they're always in this extended tight posture, well, then you got to think, where's all that energy coming from? But more, what is all that energy taking away from? What regulatory processes of the body are being kind of put on the back shelf to have all of this energy going towards motor control? So we look at the total energy output of the child and also how well that energy is distributed. Are there areas that are way too high versus way too low in this whole distribution, or are things distributed normally along an equal distribution as they should be? Again, this gives us a key into the areas of your child's nervous system that need a little bit of love. They need a little bit of help, and that's what we do. So if you've seen countless doctors, if you've been to tons and tons of therapy appointments, and we work really, really well with PTs and OTs and speech therapists and feeding therapists and movement therapists. Those are all such integral parts of helping your child to use their senses properly. If you are doing all this stuff and there's still something missing, there's a good chance that we need to take a look at that root cause of what's going on in that child's nervous system to help all of those different therapies to let those cars ride on a nice, smooth road. We're going to dig in, we're going to look way back, we're going to talk about your pregnancy, we're going to talk about the birth process, we're going to start not from ground zero, we're going to be digging down in the basement. And we're going to be starting in that basement as we learn and we understand what's going on with your child so we can best come up with a tailored plan to figure out A, what's going on, but also B, to give you guys some hope, to give you guys some answers, to give you guys a plan. And when we look at all these things and we put them together, that's how we help these kids.